A blonde-haired knight fought against a swarthy woman with horns on her head. Her face was covered by a cloak. The young man didn't understand why his enemy's sword didn't split after his hardest blow. He bounced to the side, and at the same time the demon queen asked who made her sword. Both hilt had the mark of a strange blacksmith on it. It was now obvious that not only were their strengths on par, but also the strength of their weapons. The queen said there was no point in fighting any further. It would be a waste of time. They decided to tell everything to the blacksmith and learn about his discontent, to understand to continue the war or to stop it. The knight and the queen said goodbye and went their separate ways. The strange blacksmith worked tirelessly in his forge. His assistant said that there was enough to do for today, and they all went to dinner together. The blacksmith stood in the middle of the clearing and reflected on the fact that it had been a long time since he had been in this world. He had died after being hit by a truck because he wanted to save a cat that was walking along the road. He woke up in an empty space with a mysterious girl. She said he was dead and she was now restraining his body from decomposing, channeling his consciousness and soul back into the dead shell. This was the same cat he had saved. She traveled among the various parallel dimensions and observed the worlds, eliminating what would upset the balance. She watched his world in the form of a cat, and because of her mistake, she almost died. The man himself should not have died at that moment, and so a hole was formed, and to compensate for his death, the girl was going to create a new being. The man asked why couldn't she just make him continue to live after the accident. Catgirl replied that it would indeed be the easiest way. However, the problem was that she had already seen his death. And everything she had seen was recorded and stored in the world, so his death could not be changed. It was a constituent part of the world. In other worlds, his death was not yet recorded, which was why she wanted to move him. The man then asked what she was doing it for. The catgirl replied that she was tormented by her conscience that he died because of her, and also, in gratitude, she wanted to give him some advantage in the new world. She asked what kind of work he would like to live with. The man reflected that he had been single all his life, with no family, and worked as a programmer for a black company. He had lived a boring life without even noticing how gray and old he had gotten. The only one who will remember him is his boss, but he will soon find a replacement. There would be no one to miss him. He replied that he had a favorite hobby, creating things, and he was always attracted to blacksmithing, but he couldn't pursue it. He also really likes cats, so he would like to live a simple life with his cat. Catgirl replied that she would put more physical strength into him and add the rest of her resources in language and magic. A blinding flash formed in space, and the next moment the man was already lying on the grass in the new world. His hair was longer, and his body wore the clothes worn by the locals. A pulse went through all his blood vessels, from his fingertips to his brain. It was a stream of information about this world that the man had not known before. When the pulse passed, he realized that he had gained skills and experiences he had not known before. He stood outside his home and was surprised that that enchantress had even prepared a place for him to live. There were supplies in the kitchen that would be enough for him for the first time. But the house had no electricity, plumbing, or even a well in the neighborhood, so he had to find a source of fresh water. He found the workshop, and taking the blacksmith's hammer in his hands, he felt he knew how to use it. It was the knowledge and skills that that sorceress had put into him. She also spoke of giving him some magic. He decided to make dinner, and as he put the chopped vegetables into the pot, he decided to set it on fire with his power. From his fingers, he was able to create a small fire. But with such a tiny flame, he couldn't heat the food or melt the stove. He decided to use it as a lighter. Gathering his hair into a small ponytail, he went into the forest to look for water. He started leaving marks with his knife on the trunks of trees so that he wouldn't get lost. Walking through the forest, he saw a green squirrel, this world was much different from his home world. He took a bite of a wild apple, but it turned out to be too sour. The man was worried that no matter how much he walked, there was no village in the area. With the new information in his head, he was able to identify medicinal herbs. Gathering them, he reached the fresh water river, which happened to be a 15-minute walk from the house. Looking in his reflection, he noticed that he looked much younger. He was about 30 years old by the looks of it. The blacksmith was about to go fishing when suddenly, he saw a girl lying unconscious in the bushes. She had animal ears, claws, and a tiger-like tail. The blacksmith realized that she would not survive if he did not help her. He picked her up and carried her to his house. He sterilized the needles in boiling water and brewed herbs as a painkiller and antiseptic. Then he spread the girl out on the table, stripped her of all her clothes, and tore the sheet into bits. The deepest wound was on her stomach. He tried to stitch up her wound as carefully as possible, but he was a novice, and he was afraid she would be left with a terrible scar. He wrapped a blanket around her and watched over her sleep. The blacksmith didn't want to be a workaholic like in his previous life. He wanted to live a comfortable life, so he decided to start working leisurely from tomorrow. Continuing to sit near the tigress, he fell asleep. When the man woke up, he found that the girl, covering her nakedness with a blanket, had her claws on him with a menacing look. Chapter 2. The tigress plopped the blacksmith on the floor and sat on top of him, cradling his face with her paw. The man asked her if the wound on her stomach hurt. The girl replied that it hurt, but not as much, and then asked in return if he had considered her naked. The blacksmith said he had been forced to undress her to treat and sew up her wounds, but he had not touched any other parts of her body. He swore to that, and then the girl got off him, saying she would trust him, even though she could smell him as a liar. The man said that the tigress' blood was soaked with blood, and so he had to tear it to get it off her body, and held out her long shirt. The tiger girl dressed herself and said she didn't care. They were just simple rags she didn't care to lose. Afterward, the tigress asked the man what he was doing here, and if this was his home. The blacksmith didn't want to lie much, and admitted that he was just about to start his blacksmithing business, and had moved into this house just yesterday. The girl said that she didn't remember there being a house in this part of the Black Forest, though she rarely entered this area and just might have overlooked it. The house was in the east, and the tigress most often wandered north and west. Yesterday, she had wanted to take a break, but she had run into a large black bear and had barely escaped it with her wounds. If the man hadn't saved her, but the bear would most likely have found her and torn her to pieces. The blacksmith was surprised at this information and thought he was very lucky that when he was walking through the forest yesterday, he had not come across this bear himself. He asked the tigress how long it would take her to recover from her wounds. She replied that her beastman abilities were much higher than normal humans, but even she with such a deep wound would need rest. She estimated that she could fully recover in 2 weeks. The blacksmith asked the girl if she would like to stay in his house then. Since she needed to recover, she could stay with him, and since he was just starting his business, he needed an assistant to help with the household. He would provide her with shelter and food for her help. The tigress was surprised, but agreed to the deal. She said that as long as he didn't smell suspicious, she would trust him. The blacksmith asked the girl what her name was, and she said her name was Samia. He said it was a very beautiful name, but the tigress did not like it. Then the blacksmith said that anyway, that was the name her family had given her and it suited her very well. He then introduced himself as Izot Nuya, which was his name in his past life. Samaya was surprised that Izo had a last name, and said that mostly nobles, those with status and their own estates, had last names. She then said that by his appearance he was a man of the north, and then didn't ask about the family name, assuming that people of the north all had family names. From this dialogue, Izo realized that the people of the north were Asians, and said that in that case there was no need to call him by his last name, and it would be sufficient to address him only by his first name. Aizo began work in the forge. He started a fire and heated the coals. This was enough preparation. His first item he wanted to make was a large knife. He heated the coals with fire magic and maintained the temperature with wind magic. Once everything was heated to the right temperature, he began to work on the metal. After melting it into a mold, he began to hammer to compact the dough. As he worked, Aizo realized that he was much stronger than he had been in his previous life, as it had been easy enough for him to draw water and carry Samiya the previous day. But now to work with a heavy hammer and a roaster all day. He polished the blade with a file and sharpened it on the sharpening stone. When the blade was ready, he decided to test its point. Aizo placed a bunch of greens on the wooden board and pressed the knife down. It was so sharp that it not only easily cut through the greens, but even chopped the board it was lying on. Aizo was frightened by such insane sharpness of the knife, which was made thanks to the preferential mode, a gift given to him by the goddess. He decided that such a knife was too dangerous in the kitchen, and it would be much better to use it for self-defense. He decided to use the advantage mode not always, and to create 3 more knives, the quality of which would be higher and lower than the one he had already created. This would be determined by their point, so that some would be safe to use when cooking, and others would help in battle. After a while, he woke the sleeping Samiya and told her that dinner was ready. Samiya said that no matter how much rest she got, she still felt like sleeping all the time. Suddenly, she saw Aizo light a lamp and wondered if he could wield magic. The man replied that he could only do simple spells and handed a plate of stew to the girl. He said that food was just as important to her recovery. They had roast meat and vegetables for dinner. In this world, Aizo still needed money to buy food, firewood, and materials for the forge. The next day, Aizo called Samiya to him and asked her to try out the 4 knives he had made. The first knife was the bluntest. With it, Samiya easily chopped the greens. With the second knife, she was also able to chop the greens, but it was even faster and easier, which the girl did not expect. She shouted to the man that she was amazed at how skillfully this blade could cut, while Aizo nonchalantly appraised each blade from the side. She took the last one and chopped the greens along with the cutting board. Aizo told her to pull the knife out now, and as it slid out of the wood, Samiya cried out in panic, amazed at the sharpness of that blade. The man excitedly asked the girl to put the knife down before she, in shock, accidentally hurt herself. The beast man marveled at the blacksmith's first-class abilities, while Aizo thought about the uses of these knives and how to sell them. Samiya said she was willing to buy the sharpest knife, as it would come in handy when she was hunting. Aizo said that if she wanted it, she could have it for nothing without paying for it. He also offered to make her another knife personalized for her, and the girl lit up with happiness when she heard that. While cleaning the forge, Aizo thought that he could continue to make such knives in the future by lowering the level, and they would be suitable for sale as farm knives. He was going to make some more farming tools and sell them for a living. He had heard that there was a town beyond the forest with a busy market on weekends, and that was where he was going to start his business. Chapter 3. Aizo finished his examination and changed Samiya's bandages, but she was still unable to hunt. Aizo suggested she go with him to the market the next day. The blacksmith had been creating knives all week to sell on the weekend. He was excited to go with Samiya as she told him about the local ecology and surroundings along the forest road. The man was worried that they would meet wolves or boars along the way, but the girl replied that she felt his strength and they would be safe with him, even if he himself did not know his own strength. The road was traveled without incident, and passing the fortress, they found themselves inside the city. There was a marketplace outside the outer walls, and since the city mostly existed through trade, there was no need to pay to enter. Izo was stopped by a guard and asked him to show his goods before letting him inside. After looking at the knives, the guard let the blacksmith pass and asked him not to cause trouble in the market. 1 silver coin must be paid to enter the market itself, after which the merchant is given a counter and a wooden plaque with permission to trade. The seat is taken by the first person to arrive. But in 2 hours, Izo and Samaya still hadn't sold anything. No matter how hard the man tried to present his goods, no one would look at his knives. A guard who had skipped by the fortress approached them and decided to buy one of the knives he had seen earlier. He already had a knife, but it wasn't as sharp and he had to constantly sharpen it, so he decided to buy a new one. Izo asked for 5 silver coins. The knight was very surprised at such a low price. In fact, the man and the tigress had set such prices in order to at least sell something, as they assumed that the sale would be given with difficulty. After the purchase, he told the blacksmith that when he came to the unit for lunch, he would tell his comrades about the knives. And maybe some of the other knights would also want to buy something from him. The blacksmith was very happy that he finally got the first money for the item he made with his own hands. They never bought anything else from them for the next 3 hours. Suddenly, Izo's counter was surrounded by a whole crowd of guards. He was frightened by their arrival, for he had done nothing offensive. As it turned out, Marius, who had bought a knife from them, showed it to his comrades, and they wanted one just like it. In the end, Izo sold all his goods and went home with Samia, with a large profit in his pocket. As they returned, the man thought about setting up Samia's own room for a long time. As they were putting the groceries they had bought in the pantry, the girl asked the man if he could make metal arrowheads. The tigress' main weapon was a bow and arrow, and she wanted quality arrows from the blacksmith to hunt with. Izo replied that he would make arrows for her, and the girl was pleased. The next day he decided to focus on making knives, and once he had the right batch made, he would start on the arrows. He made a mold out of clay, then poured the heated steel into it and waited for it to cool. Afterward, Izo made a large saw for cutting trees and improved his axe. He went out into the courtyard with Samia and chopped a large tree with one blow, and then he and the girl sawed it into planks so that it would be easier to make wooden arrow shafts. By the end of the day, the first arrow was ready. While Izo was putting the finishing touches on it, sitting at the table, Samaya asked if she could stay with him longer. Her wounds had already healed, but not having a home of her own, having to constantly wander the forest, she hoped the man would take her into his home for good. Izo gladly invited her to live together as neighbors and friends. Afterward, he handed her an arrow, which the tigress was absolutely delighted with. Meanwhile, in one of the taverns of the town, a young man was bragging about his newly bought knife to a fellow. He said that when the blacksmith came again, he would buy one from him. A dark-haired girl came up to them and asked to see the knife. Chapter 4. Izo, handing Samia's lunch, asked her to be more careful when hunting as she had only recently recovered from her wounds, and told her that if she smelled danger, she should return home immediately. While her friend was on the hunt, the man continued to restock his goods. He decided to make only knives and long swords. The female forms cooled down, and he began to work with them. They were molds created by dipping the men's molds in clay for parts. He poured molten iron into the mold with sand, and afterward he ground the burrs on the finished blades. Normally, all these steps of weapon creation would be done by different people, but thanks to the priority mode, he was able to do everything himself. Finally, he carved a seal on the hilt of the sword, marking the logo of his forge, in the shape of a cat that Izo had liked very much in the video game in his past life. He began swinging the sword from side to side, imagining himself a knight, when Samaya caught him. She looked happy, the reason being that she was finally welcomed home by someone. The girl managed to kill the wood deer, pulled out its organs and soaked it in the lake. The next morning she would be able to get the carcass out, and they would cut it up for meat. Samaya praised the arrows that penetrated deeply into the killed animal. As they cut the pieces, the man was surprised that they ended up resembling the store-bought fillet he was used to in his past life. Now he realized that in his former world, why the fruit was so sweet and the meat cut into easy-to-eat pieces was a credit to human effort. Placing the pieces strung on sticks by the fire, Iso asked his friend what she had done with the insides of the deer. The tigress replied that she had left them in the forest for the wolves to eat. Iso tasted the meat and was delighted, as he hadn't eaten fresh in a long time. His pantry was mostly dried and dried meat. They definitely hung the fresh cuts out to dry as well so they wouldn't go to waste. Samaya wasn't going hunting, so she helped Iso by grinding burrs off the items. When the new batch was ready, they set off again for the city. At the entrance, they were met, as before, by Marius-san. He noticed the blacksmith swords and said he would come over later to see the assortment. Iso sat down at the counter and sent Samia to buy groceries, handing her a list and money. A richly dressed merchant approached him and asked to see the sword. After examining the blade, the man said he would buy 4 pieces at once. He said he was a traveling merchant and wanted to keep one for himself and sell the other 3 elsewhere. Iso thought this was a great opportunity to spread the word about his forge and gratefully sold the swords. He even thought about saving up some money one day and going on a business trip to other cities with Samia himself. After the merchant, Marius-san came to Iso's place along with his companions. The ordinary long sword model was completely sold out. The only one left was the high-end model, which Iso wasn't going to sell. The blacksmith told Samai that they could go home now. The girl froze, looking at a dwarf in the crowd. Dwarves were dwarves who practiced blacksmithing. Suddenly, this dwarf started looking at them himself and eventually approached. It was a little swarthy girl. She asked Iso if the guards had bought his weapons and afterward asked to examine one of his knives. Pulling it out of its leather sheath, the girl examined the blade long enough and carefully. But soon she caught a glimpse of the luxurious sword model, realizing that this piece was much better. Apologizing to the blacksmith, she took this sword in her hands and also began a long, silent consideration. When she returned the sword, she sat down on her knees and with her forehead bowed to the ground, asked Iso to take her as his apprentice. Chapter 5. Eventually, all 3 of them made their way to the tavern. They were embarrassed that a dwarf, right in the middle of the market, was kneeling in front of them, so they tried to leave as soon as possible. The girl introduced herself by the name of Moritz. But Moritz wasn't her last name. It was the name of the workshop she used to belong to as a working gnome. Dwarves are essentially groups of families that come together to form a workshop. Iso introduced himself by first name only and introduced the girl to Samia. The girl was surprised and asked the blacksmith if he came to these parts from the north. The man replied that he had indeed come from there. Due to circumstances, he settled in the Black Forest and worked as a blacksmith. Rika said that now it made sense to her why she had never seen his wares anywhere before coming to this town. Iso asked Rika why she wanted to be his apprentice. The girl replied that dwarves begin their apprenticeship at a certain age. She, along with her brothers, left the workshop to learn. She visited many places in search of her teacher. Gnomes look for good workshops and join them as apprentices, and then return home to their workshop and share the skills and knowledge they have learned to create new things with modern techniques. Iso asked if the human blacksmiths and dwarves were afraid of leaking information about their special techniques. Rika replied that people recognize that it is an honor for every workshop to have a dwarf apprentice, so it's fine, and people willingly share their knowledge with them. When she came to this city a few days ago, she found one of the knives made by Iso, and afterwards she let her brothers go to look for workshops and teachers without her, since she had decided on her choice. So if Izo didn't accept her, she would have to travel further alone, since her brothers had already left. Izo was unhappy with her naivety and asked her not to be so careless from now on. Afterward, he said he would take her on as an apprentice, but he had 4 conditions. First, he didn't like that she could sacrifice herself so easily, so she shouldn't behave like that. Second, he didn't have enough space in his house, so they would have to build an extension. Third, based on the previous point, she would have to help him with more than just blacksmithing. And fourth, he asked her to drop the formalities and call him by his first name Izo. The girl exclaimed that she couldn't fulfill the last condition because he was her teacher and she should respectfully address him by the title Master. Samaya laughed in response, and Izo looked embarrassed. The trio approached the house, and Rika looked at it with admiring eyes. When they got inside, Izo asked her if her legs were tired since she was carrying so much luggage. The girl replied that she was very sturdy and it was fine. Afterward, the man thanked Samia for worrying about them and for leading them on the safest path. They began to eat dinner, and the man warned that until they got to work on the addition, Rika would have to live with Samia. The girl excitedly said that she couldn't force them to sleep separately and wouldn't take up space on the double bed, but would just lie on the floor. Izo replied that they had always slept separately. Rika was surprised and said that she thought Izo and Samaya were married. The tigress jumped up and became indignant to hide her embarrassment that that wasn't the case at all. Izo replied that there was no such connection between the two so far, at which point Samaya was surprised at his words, so far. Afterward, the man wondered if members of different races could even get married, since Samaya was a beast man. Rika calmly replied that she realized they were just a family living in the same workshop. Izo began stroking Samia's head and said that they were indeed a family. After a night's rest, they weeded the ground to make room for an addition to the house and dug holes for posts. Samia had gone hunting, so Izo and Ricky were left alone. The girl was used to hard labor, her muscles were strong, and together with the blacksmith she worked at a fast pace. After a while, Samia came back and said that she had killed a big deer. The girl then noticed that Reich was acting strangely. With some trembling in her body, she was examining the axe. The dwarf girl replied that she was amazed at the sharpness of the axe. She wanted to chop wood, but as soon as she touched the blade to the wood, it slipped through like a knife through butter. It was incredible. Samaya replied that she too was shocked when she first saw the sharpness of Iso's blades. The man told the apprentice that tomorrow they would do some blacksmithing. They had to join forces to cut up the huge wood deer that Samaya had killed the previous morning. After a short rest, they went to the forge. They had prepared the female form last night, and now Reich was pouring red-hot metal into it. Izo noticed that the girl already had a lot of experience, and she worked hard without stopping. After making a snack, Izo decided to show her how he made knives. However, he didn't know how he could teach the girl the privileged skill the goddess had given him. He decided to be honest and admitted that he was completely inept at teaching his craft, so Reich would just have to watch him work, and from his own observations understand what to do and how to do it. Reich asked the teacher not to worry about that. Izo decided to make a model of the knife for mass production. Soon he handed the finished product to Reich for evaluation. With eyes full of admiration, she said the knife turned out amazing. She could hear the voice of the iron. Not every craftsman can hear the product. It meant it was filled with soul. But afterward, she said she noticed that the man wasn't making it at full strength or with all seriousness. Izo was surprised and asked Reich how she realized that. She replied that he just didn't look like he would be putting out full force, and besides, the quality still wasn't comparable to the sword he had shown her earlier. Izo said that this knife was for mass production and therefore not as skillful as that single sword specimen, and asked Reich to make the exact same knife. Izo had never seen others at work and marveled at Reich's labor. He looked at her knife afterward and thought it was almost indistinguishable from his own model. Out loud, he said that he felt a slight difference in strength, and yet, this knife could only get better. He praised his apprentice and said that he was sure that pretty soon she would be able to make a high-quality long sword or something else of the same level. They continued working, and Iso thought about the fact that what he was doing was his body's knowledge, received as a gift from the goddess. While other blacksmiths and dwarves studied and worked hard to gain those skills. He even thought about the fact that he shouldn't be teaching, as Reich would only be able to imitate him. He made another knife of higher quality and gave it to Reich. The girl was amazed, for even the most talented dwarf could not make such a knife, and thanked him for the gift. Samaya went into the forge and said that she had finished processing the meat and hide. She congratulated Reich on her first knife, and together they walked to the fire outside where meat on sticks was already cooking. Reich saw that Iso was using magic, and the man once again replied that he could only create simple spells. Suddenly, Samia proudly said that Iso not only used magic, he also had a last name. Reich asked the last name to the teacher, and when she heard it, she said that she was now Reich Danuya. The man asked why, at which point the dwarf replied that since she was now related to his workshop, she was taking her last name from the name of that forge. Iso said he didn't want to name the forge Tanuya, at which point the girl said she would be Reich Iso. Samia started complaining that she also wanted to call herself Samia Tanuya or Samia Iso. The man thought that he himself had offered her to live with him, and since they were one family, he allowed her to carry his name too. After dinner, Iso wondered what his special skill would bring to this world, since Reich had said that no one had ever created sharp objects like him before. Chapter 6. Thanks to Reich's serious attitude towards work and Samia's willingness to help, Iso had more time to concentrate on his work at the forge. In their workshop, Iso's work speed and efficiency improved greatly. About once a week, they went to the market to sell their products. One day, Marius told them that more and more people in town were asking him where they could buy that blacksmith's goods and when he would be coming to the market again. Iso thanked the knight for the publicity and help. Afterward, the merchant who regularly bought swords from Iso also said he would stop by later. The common model, sold best, was a standard knife that even housewives willingly bought. It was very sharp to cut food, but not as dangerous and didn't chop wood like other models. The middle-class model was for those who were used to handling blades of a quality a few notches higher than ordinary. Such knives and swords were purchased by knights, guards, hunters, and mercenaries. The last model Iso did not flaunt. It was a high-quality battle sword, which he was going to give to a worthy man when he was convinced of his merit and right to carry such a sword. He carried it with him into town in case he met such a knight, but he always left it wrapped in cloth and did not show it on the counter. The merchandise was sold quickly today, and the man and his charges went out for a lunch of sandwiches. Iso said that the people who bought merchandise from them were spreading good word about them. Reich reminded them that they needed to think about restocking there or in coal supplies. Iso realized that he really didn't have a supplier, and whatever was available in the house was starting to run out. He decided to ask the merchant he was working with if he knew any suppliers of the resources he needed. The merchant was just walking in their direction. Iso told the man that thanks to his advertising, they were able to sell out very quickly. The man replied that he was happy for them and added that he was being asked to stock more of Iso's forge. The blacksmith replied that if he had known about this in advance, he would have made more goods before coming here. The merchant appreciated the blacksmith's diligence and said that he was going to open his own store instead of the small store in the market. In this store, he was going to place various goods from the artisans he cooperated with, including Iso. Iso agreed, and then the merchant introduced himself by the name of Camillo, and shaking hands with his new companion said he was glad to meet him. Iso then said that he lived in the Black Forest. The merchant was surprised and told the blacksmith that he could live anywhere, but then realized that since he was a northerner and he was accompanied by a beast man and a dwarf, they would indeed be more at ease in the forest. Izo said that the timing of the bulk sale would be about once a week, and he would tell in advance if anything changed. Afterwards, he asked for a favor. The thing was that his forge was running out of resources, and he was just on the lookout for someone who could help them with that. Camillo said he could buy and deliver the materials to them with a deduction from the price of the finished goods. Izo was very happy that he could so easily negotiate a supply of ore and coal. Camillo said he would wait for them next week, and afterwards said goodbye. Izo, Reich and Samiya arrived a week later at the address Camillo had told them. The store turned out to be a huge two-story house. Inside indeed turned out to be a wide variety of goods. Izo's swords and knives hung on the wall on framed supplies, and in the corner was information about his forge. It didn't look like a counter for sale at all, but more like the stuff of a museum exhibit. Camillo greeted his friends and motioned for them to go to the second floor to talk. Izo listed the items he had brought and asked how much to leave in the store. Camillo replied that he needed everything he had, since these items do sell out quickly and are popular. Izo was surprised and asked Camillo if he was really that famous a merchant. The man replied that he had many connections, selling things to the general public, travelers, professionals, etc. Izo thought in his mind that it was like a supermarket from his past life. Camillo asked Izo to custom make a sword, but the blacksmith refused. He said he needed to know the identity of the person he was to make the sword for, as well as his fighting skills, so he would prefer to choose the warrior he wanted the sword for himself. Camillo offered to test the customer on his skills, then placed the order through his store. Izo agreed to the offer, but decided that as a test, it would be fine if the customer could make it to his forge in person. His house was located in the forest, and if the customer could walk through the forest path, passing through the obstacles in the form of animals and other dangers, it meant that he was already worthy of something and could possess some weapon skills, and the order could also be placed through Camillo's store. He asked the merchant to refer a potential customer if the man himself deemed worthy or not. Camillo agreed, and Samiya and Reich supported Izo's decision. Afterward, the blacksmith asked if Camillo had procured the materials needed for the forge. The merchant escorted them to the warehouse, which was as huge as the store. There were considerably more materials than 1 week's supply. Camillo said he could maintain such a stock on a regular basis. Izo asked how much the merchant was willing to charge, and when he heard, he was shocked. Only a quarter of the wholesale price of the finished product. The blacksmith asked why was it so cheap? After all, they were making a good profit. Camillo replied with a smile that he was already getting a lot from his store. He was willing to take care of those who would bring him even more money in the future, and with whom he was going to build a long partnership. So he wanted to help Izo as much as possible in the beginning. The blacksmith thanked the merchant and asked if he had thought about how they would get all the materials to the forge. The merchant replied that he hadn't thought about it, but he had an old unneeded cart that he was willing to give away for free. Izo, Samiya, and Reich transferred the ore and coal into the cart and set off for home. On the way, they thought about the fact that they could have people coming directly to their forge because of the publicity, and it would be good to clear the one path that led to their house. Suddenly, Samiya smelled a wolf and asked everyone to stop to wait for it to pass by. Izo said that they had started to run into wolves a lot. Samiya replied that they were about to have a brood, so they would soon be able to see them with the little wolf cubs. Reich asked why were the wolves in this forest peaceful and not attacking them. Samiya answered the girl that there were many tree deer and grass rabbits in this forest, so no one had to worry about prey. Everyone was well fed. And because of that, the wolves were not aggressive. Plus, they sensed Iso's strength and wouldn't approach him. Samiya asked Reich to never go into the forest alone, and if she needed anything, she should always go accompanied by either her or Izo. Reich said she understood, and afterwards suggested that the local wolves had evolved from the power of the forest. Samaya said they weren't the only ones who were dangerous. The forest was also home to bears. At this memory, she clutched her long-heeled stomach. Izo noticed this and thought about the fact that that black bear that had injured the girl was still roaming somewhere in the forest and causing her fear and apprehension. The black bear, smelling other people's odors, was slowly approaching the blacksmith's house from the thicket of the forest day after day. Chapter 7. Izo heard to create new weapons thanks to the materials she had acquired. Reich told her teacher that the new parts turned out better than the previous ones, and was glad that they were able to stock up on more metals to try and experiment on something new. They put the cast iron they had purchased from Camillo into a magical furnace that did not produce slag. This was efficient, because with this they could reuse the metal without harming the furnace itself. Reich was impressed by things she wasn't used to. Izo was helped by a special regimen for efficiency, and because of this, his business flourished without the need to hire additional staff. After a couple days, Izo was able to create the item he was working on. Samaya asked the blacksmith to come over to her for a moment. The man was surprised to find that the girls had finished making the roof of the outhouse while he was working in the forge. He thanked the girls for their hard work and apologized for rarely visiting them at the house this week. He thought it was hard for the girls to do the construction, but the girls, glowing with happiness, said that they were very strong and they were only happy to work. Izo said that he had talked earlier with Camillo about buying extra bedding next week, and now all they had to do was make the doors, beds, and other furniture. Reich was very surprised when she heard that Izo was going to put a door in every room. It was customary in her family that only the master bedroom of the master of the house and his wife and the guest bedroom had a door. Everyone else slept without doors. Samai had nothing to compare it to, as she had spent her entire life in the open-air forest. Izo stubbornly stated that in his house each family member would have their own room with a door, and that was out of the question. Samaya asked the man if he was going to go into town this week. Izo replied that he was going to stay home, and afterward he decided to give them all a day off. He had worked hard every day since he had come to this world, but now he had a lot of finished goods and trade established, and he decided they all deserved a day off. The next day, the whole family decided to fish by the river and have a picnic, just as Izo had wanted since the first day he arrived in these parts. They got out their fishing rods and hooks, and gathered worms and bugs hiding under rocks. Izo thought Samaya and Reich would be scared of the worms, but they were not intimidated by such things, and they picked them up with interest. They then launched the bait into the water and waited in silence for the catch. Samaya and Reich were catching fish with ease, but Izo was having no luck. The girls laughed and said that maybe he had too much bloodlust in him and the fish, sensing it, wouldn't swim to his hook. They took a break for lunch, after which the girls fell asleep. Upon waking up, they continued fishing. In the end, each of the girls caught 3 fish. That's one for each family member for 2 meals. Izo, still fiercely hungry for a catch with a menacing look, didn't want to be so embarrassed in his girlfriend's eyes and wished to catch at least 1 fish. Suddenly, his hook began to twitch. Izo pulled the rods and caught 1 fish. The girls praised the head of the family, barely containing their laughter at his proud appearance. The fishing was not very fruitful, but they had a rest. Back home, Izo decided that from the next day he would continue working and building the house. Chapter 8. The building was finished, and the whole family celebrated the event at a festive table. They made beds, bought linens, built shelves and shelves out of boards, and filled them with various household utensils. Now it was truly a family home. Izo went back to his bedroom, and they converted the study into a guest room. Not far from the house, they began to clear the land to plant with the seeds they had bought from Camillo. The shovels and hoes Izo had created early in his career finally came in handy in his own home. He wanted to live completely on his own. Samiya caught deer and hares, they gathered nuts and berries, but vegetables and grains still had to be bought in town. Which was why the man dreamed of making his own vegetable garden. The next night he finally lay in his bed, which Samiya had occupied before, with Reich sleeping next to him on the hammock. Before that, as in his past office life, he used to sleep at his desk. Apparently, he would never get rid of the habit of a workaholic. The next morning, a girl came to their house in battle clothes, with a scar on her face. Her name was Helen. She was a mercenary, and had decided to order new blades from Izo, as the previous ones had fallen into disrepair. Once inside, the girl said it was hard to find the place. She avoided the beasts in the forest, even saw a bear in the distance, and walked towards the smoke coming from their chimney. Samiya tensed at the mention of the bear. Helena said she could have killed it, but her current swords wouldn't be up to such a task. Izo examined Helena's current weapons. They were two short swords, very high quality, but they already had a lot of scars on them, and it was difficult to sharpen them again. Izo decided to make exactly the same ones, but first he needed to see Helena in battle to see how she worked with such weapons. They went out into the courtyard. Helena showed a few moves on the tree, but it wasn't enough. Izo wanted to nominate Samiya, since the Kona was an experienced archer and a strong beastman, but she refused and said that Izo was much stronger than her, even though she didn't see her own potential. The blacksmith agreed to a practice fight and stepped forward with sword in hand, hoping his body itself knew what to do. Helena was incredibly fast, and Izo barely had time to dodge her attacks. He endured 15 minutes of fighting until he was completely exhausted. Helena said with a laugh that she only wanted to show a couple moves, but got carried away. She was a famous warrior. She was even nicknamed Lightning Sword for being so fast. Izo told the girl that she could come back for the finished swords in 3 days. Helena wanted to continue the fight, but the blacksmith said that he would then take much longer to make the blades. The girl then, with a cheerful and energetic look, said she would like to see him make the swords. Eventually, Izo accepted her to live for all 3 days in the guest room. With a cocky laugh, Helena thanked the man, clapping him hard on the back. That was how Izo received his first customer.